Welcome back to our introduction to early modern philosophy. And today, finally, we have arrived at the biggest philosopher of them all, the most famous, the beginning of early modern philosophy, which is, of course, Rene Descartes. Descartes was a French scientist, mathematician, philosopher. He was born in France. He was educated in a Jesuit school. Jesuits are an order of the Catholic Church who emphasize education in logic and in rhetoric, in the traditional scholastic sciences. And even today, there are Jesuit schools that are considered good schools because the Jesuits are so thorough in their educational mission. While he was in the Jesuit school, he was acquainted with the philosophy primarily of ancient Greece, with medieval philosophy, but also with mathematics and the sciences. And the Jesuits also obviously were teaching about Galileo, although he was not in the favor of the church. But the Jesuits always had a thing of being a little bit revolutionary about what they taught, and not necessarily sticking to the letter of what the Pope perhaps would have liked to. Descartes then studied law, but decided not to practice it because he was not interested in it. He was interested in the sciences. And he says himself, and now I read it to you, "I entirely abandoned the study of letters, resolving to seek no knowledge other than that which could be found in myself or else in that great book of the world. I spent the rest of my youth traveling, visiting courts and armies, mixing with people of diverse temperaments and ranks, gathering various experiences, testing myself in the situations which fortune offered me, and at all times reflecting upon whatever came my way to derive some profit from it." So you see, he traveled widely, and because of his wide travels and his involvement with armies and royal courts, it is sometimes thought that he might have been a spy, he might have been spying for one government or the other, and this might have contributed also to his death later, but this is not clear. It's more of a conspiracy theory, but I think it's an interesting one, gives a little color to the person. He then became a military officer. He studied military engineering, and there he also learned more about mathematics and physics, naturally, which he could later use in his career as a mathematician and philosopher. In the winter of 1619, he reports that he had 3 dreams in one night, and in these dreams a divine voice showed him how to do proper philosophy, how to go back to the first principles of philosophy, and there he came up with his famous sentence, "I think, therefore I am," which until today is Descartes' motto. Wikipedia says that he might have had an orphan with him in a small room, in a small area, which might have caused some kind of poisoning, perhaps carbon monoxide poisoning or something else, which made him have these vivid dreams. We don't know. But it is interesting that often in science, revolutionary ideas have been attributed to dreams. I think of the Kekulé, which was the discovery of a benzene ring. This was supposed to have happened in a dream. And there are many other instances where scientists report that they got ideas from dreams. So perhaps it's not such an unusual thing that the subconscious works in the dream on the problems that somebody is thinking about and then arrives at a solution. Again, he traveled widely through the Netherlands and France, and he met with all sorts of famous people of his time. At some point he became the most famous philosopher of the time. He was sought after. Kings wanted to meet him. And what I find an interesting little detail is that for 6 years he lived with his girlfriend in an inn. So he was such a famous philosopher, but he preferred to live in an inn where people left him alone rather than to live at a royal court where he would have been much more busy socializing. For 6 years, he had a correspondence. He exchanged letters with Elizabeth of Bohemia, who was an educated young woman interested in Descartes. She was a princess, obviously. She spoke very good Greek and Latin and many other languages. And she read Descartes and she was interested in his philosophy, and she wrote him back. And they discussed his philosophy, primarily more the psychological aspects, but also his ideas about mind and body. And this is today even interesting to read as an introduction to Descartes. One can read the letters to Elizabeth. And it is amazing how strong a critic Elizabeth was of Descartes. She never believed his distinction between mind and body and his arguments for it. And she criticized him in these letters. And this is very interesting to see today, because we always have this thought that women did not perhaps engage at all in philosophy back then. But some women could, I mean, privileged people, right, princesses, could, and they could actually also argue against, criticize famous philosophers and engage in dialogue with them. And so this is an interesting thing to read even today. In 1649, which is 1 year before his death, Christina, Queen of Sweden, wanted to meet Descartes, and she asked him to come to her court and teach her his theories of love. But it did not work out at all. So Descartes went there, of course. You didn't say no to a queen, and probably he would also earn some good money from this. He went up to Sweden, but after he was established there, installed there in his guest rooms, he noticed that Christina actually never had time for him. She was busy, so the only time they could meet for classes was in the morning at 5 o'clock, and this was winter in Sweden, so it was icy, it was cold, it was drafty, the wind blew through the castles, and the poor Frenchman could not survive this. He caught pneumonia, and he died a few months later in Sweden. And again, because of his connection with these different armies and courts and visits to famous people, there was always this rumor that he might have been poisoned. We don't know exactly by whom, and perhaps it's just a rumor. It could have been religious opponents of his, there could have been opponents of his philosophy, could have been people who didn't like his association with Christina of Sweden, with the queen, or his influence on her, or there might have been really something related to his spying activities. But it might also have been just a case of pneumonia and the cold Swedish weather. So what is Descartes' main contribution to philosophy? His two most important books, of course, you've heard about them probably, the Discourse on the Method, the Discourse on Method, however you want to call it in English, and the Meditations on First Philosophy. So when you read the title, the Meditations on First Philosophy, you ask yourself, okay, why first? What is first? So first in this case means the philosophy that comes first when we want to understand the world, when we want to ask, what do we know about the world? How can we even understand the world? These are the first questions that we must ask. There is no use, doing physics or doing astronomy or doing ethics if we don't clarify at the very beginning what can we even know about the world, right? Perhaps we are mistaken about everything. Perhaps our senses deceive us. And the first philosophy is about that. Metaphysics, we call it today, right? The philosophy of what is beyond physics. Basic epistemology, what do we know about the world? What can we know about the world? What is the world really? Is it as it appears, or is it different in some way? These are the questions of the first philosophy that we need to do in order to later progress to all the other philosophies. And of course, the most famous statement, we already mentioned it, and we will mention it later also, we will read where it comes from, is, I think, therefore I am, as it is translated often in English. And this is from the Discourse on Method from 1637. This book has been written in French, which is also interesting that Descartes wrote it in French first, because it shows you how the languages of the people slowly start to become more important, even in scientific discourse. In the Middle Ages, you would have written only in Latin because this was the language of scientific communication. But now in Descartes' time, they start writing in French. They write in the normal national languages also. Of course, the book was also translated later to Latin, but it is interesting that Descartes wrote it in French. Okay, very briefly about the philosophy that he learned with the Jesuits, just to give you a little bit of context. Now we know his life. How did he grow up? What did he grow up learning? The Jesuits would have taught him physics, of course, they did, mathematics, some rudimentary mathematics and physics that were known at that time, but they also taught what is called scholastic philosophy. Scholastic philosophy is the philosophy of the Middle Ages and is mostly based on Aristotle, on philosophical and theological discussions. There is also a lot of Christian philosophy, Thomas Aquinas from the High Middle Ages, that was very influential in this time, and this was also based on Aristotle and sometimes on Plato. So we have Plato, we have Aristotle, we have Aquinas, we have the other Christian philosophers, St. Augustine and others, and these would be mainly the topics that are taught in scholastic philosophy. And also they had focus on argumentation, on dialectic, on how to make an argument, how to convince your opponent, how to make good arguments, distinguish them from bad arguments. So all this area of critical thinking and logic and argumentation was another thing that he would have been taught. And of course, we also talked already about metaphysics in the Middle Ages, the problem of universal. So if you go back a few videos, you can find a video about this where we discuss the problem of universals. This would have been a thing in his time. And we see that all these philosophers later also discuss, in the early modern periods, they all discuss the problem of universals too in their own way. They name it differently. They don't call it universals anymore. They might call it something like innate ideas, or they might call it, empiricism or rationalism. But these are ideas that go back to this question from the Middle Ages about what a universal actually is, a universal term. How do we come to talk about horses? What do we mean when we say a horse in general? Do we mean a particular horse? Do we mean an idea of a general horse? What happens in our mind when we use these universal terms? And so Descartes would have learned the scholastic philosophy, but the scholastic philosophy, being part of the teachings of the Church, was not really interested in radical questioning. The scholastic philosophy was about learning what the ancients said, learning what the Church authorities say, and then learning to defend it through dialogue, through dispute, but not really fundamentally questioning it, obviously. And this was not what Descartes wanted. So he felt like the scholastic philosophy is taking away some of his freedom to think, is missing the important questions, and he was unhappy about it. He acknowledged later that it was a good education, that it had value, but that it was not the right thing for him. And especially, of course, he never wanted to become a lawyer. So when he left school, he then traveled widely around the country trying to learn things by himself and also to follow his own thoughts that were not the thoughts of this scholastic education. Another thing we will talk about a little later are the four causes of Aristotle. That's another pillar of scholastic philosophy. Aristotle said there are four different kinds of causes that bring about a thing. So if I think of a table, for example, then I have a material cause, which is the wood, the material it is made of. I have a formal cause, the shape of the table. I have an efficient cause, it's the person who makes the table or whatever causes the table to come about. This is what we today would call mostly, a cause. And then we also have the final cause. And the final cause is interesting because the final cause for Aristotle is the purpose of something. So it will be the purpose. Why is this table there? Why is it made? What's the purpose of the table? It is, for example, dining. So dining is the final cause. And you see that this contradicts totally what we today think of a cause, because we think a cause must be before the effect, right, in order to cause the effect. But for Aristotle, things are caused also by effects that are in the future, by causes that are in the future, you could say. So the table is caused by my wish to have something to dine on, which is not, it's not obviously wrong. It is another interpretation of what a cause means or what a cause is. And so this is important. At the time of Descartes, these final causes were important. So of course, it's also important for Christians, because then the world has a final cause, right, which is to achieve the goal that God had in mind for the world, to achieve God's plan. And so every human being has a final cause, has a reason for existing, has a purpose in God's plan. So it's understandable that in a Christian worldview, there are these final causes. They are important because they reflect God's plans for the world. But in modern science, we don't want this, right? We don't agree that they are final causes. Modern science thinks only of causes that are mechanistical in the way that they are before the effect, and then they cause the effect in time, earlier in time, and then you have the effect later in time, instead of having some future thing, some future purpose causing something. And Descartes was very much opposed also to this idea of final causes. So this was another point where he disagreed with scholastic philosophy and with Aristotle. We don't need to go more into the depths of this. I will have other videos where we talk about Aristotle later and the history of the metaphysics of Aristotle, and then we will go more into detail with this. But just so you know, when you read somewhere about the final causes or the four causes, these are the four causes of Aristotle, and Descartes was opposed to the final cause. If we want to describe what Descartes is doing in philosophy, we can just throw out a few words. Rationalism is a thing for Descartes, the idea that I can understand the world with my mind only. I don't need, experiences of the world. And actually these experiences are misleading, can be, I can be dreaming, it can be under the influence of drugs. So the only reliable knowledge about the world is the one I get from my thoughts, from my mind. Mechanism is another thing for Descartes. The world is, as opposed to Aristotle's final cause, completely controlled by causes that come before it. It's a mechanistical system. Molecules, we would say today, is not a word that Descartes would have used, but atoms and molecules collide, and with the laws of physics, they do what they do, and they cause everything else to happen. And when a billiard ball, rolls somewhere over the table, then there's another ball that has hit it before. So there are always mechanistical causes and effects, and these chains of causes and effects create what we see as the actions in the world. So there are no mysterious actions, there are no God intervening, there is no future plans. Everything happens according to physical causes and effects. Dualism, Descartes is famous for his dualism. He thinks that the body and the mind are totally different. They are not the same thing, they are not the same substance. We have body, we have mind or soul, and this mind or soul is of a totally different nature. As the body, it controls the body, it is perhaps like a steering element that can control the body, tell the body what to do, but it is separate from the body, and it's not material. So the laws of physics apply to bodies, not only, of course, human bodies, but any kind of body, in physics, any material thing. But the laws of physics don't apply to the mind. So this leaves open the possibility that the soul exists and the soul lives after the body and all these things. And it also explains, why we are free. The bodies are in this physical mechanistic universe, but our minds are not. And so we have a freedom of our mind. We have the essential freedom to decide what we want to do and so on, although the world is physically deterministic, but the mind is not, because it's of a different nature. He rejects final ends, we already mentioned this, and he rejects empiricism, the idea that we can learn from the senses. The senses are actually misleading. Of course, sometimes we need to look at our senses for particular information, but the basic information about the world, how the world works, what it is made of, the basic truths of philosophy can only be achieved through, examining the mind, not the senses. Okay, and now we want to talk a little about the discourse on method, and we will do this in the next video, so stay with me, and we will actually have a look at the text. We will read a little bit of it, and then we will see what this is all about, the famous book, The Discourse on the Method. Thank you, and see you in the next video.